We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Jasper Nathaniel, journalist covering Israel's occupation of the West Bank, other political cultural affairs, on one of my daily reads, Infinite Jaz Substack. You can find it at infinitejaz.substack.com. Folks, honestly, it is a one-stop shop for me to find out the horrors that are going on, particularly in the West Bank, because we have a lot of coverage, obviously, on what's happening in Gaza. And but to understand what's happening in the West Bank, what has been happening, and the historical sort of like broad strokes and sometimes more narrow strokes of what's going on there, very important because, you know, we were saying this in the run-up to the election. Donald Trump was sort of floating, or there seemed to be sort of some, like, you know, sort of opening for Miriam Adelson.
Oh yeah.
And we read reporting that Trump was looking for money from Miriam Adelson, anywhere from $100 to $120 million. That we know of, and he ended up getting that money. And the reporting was that she wanted U.S. recognition of Israel's annexation of the West Bank. And I learned from your reporting, Jasper, that she just got a medal from Israel. Interesting timing.
She got the Presidential Medal of, I think it's the Medal of Honor, not the Medal of Freedom. She got it the exact same week that Rubio and Huckabee signaled that Trump was okay with them annexing the West Bank. So, yeah, you guys have been on that for a long time. And I remember, Sam, I've been saying to you, just so you know, she's denied that quid pro quo. I just wanted to be careful about it, but it does, in fact, seem like that may have been the case.
All right, so let's go back, and you have a great piece that you wrote. I guess it was about a week ago now, that really both speaks to the history to some extent, but also sort of like the various options as to where are we today? Because even in that past week, things have moved rather quickly.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you where we were like 10 minutes ago, but it may have changed since then. Okay, so basically, last time I was on the show, I talked about this sort of quiet annexation of the West Bank. And just to quickly refresh your audience, the West Bank is legally and technically under a military occupation. It has been since 1967. And because of that, it ostensibly has to adhere to international law around military occupation. And what those laws amount to are that, number one, it's temporary. The occupation is temporary. And so what that means is that the occupying state, Israel, cannot do anything to put roots down. For example, building a home there, or building a village, or a whole city, or infrastructure, or roads. And so for that reason, the settlement enterprise is fundamentally illegal, not just like the building itself, but the whole thing is fundamentally against international law. And then the other part of the international law basically says, like, anything else that Israel does has to be for security purposes. So they can't just do things because they want to do it. It has to be either for the well-being of the occupied people or for security purposes. In early 2023, Smotrich, who was just became finance minister, he's this extremist settler. He works out a deal where he basically gets inserted into the defense ministry. And inside of the defense ministry, he builds what is effectively a shadow government called the Settlement Administration that takes over all governing bureaucratic responsibilities from the people who were actually in the Defense Department. And so what that means is the people who had been working in the defense ministry and the military, they certainly were not never had the interests of the Palestinian people in mind, but they didn't necessarily have the same ideological commitments as the settlers, right? Like, they were not just hell-bent on annexing the whole territory. Now, the new people in charge who are making all the decisions are handpicked by Smotrich. They're almost all settlers. And so every decision that has to be made about whether or not to greenlight a settlement or to greenlight demolishing a Palestinian village, it doesn't have to go through these like annoying military lawyers who have to at least pretend to adhere to international law. It just immediately gets signed off. So that's been happening for 2.5 years, basically.
And I just want to just so the people understand, exactly, or not exactly, but have a decent sense of where of who Smotrich is. This is a guy who was found to have committed essentially a terrorist attack. I mean, and this is coming from the Israelis. And so, I mean, that was, I guess, 20 some odd years ago. Maybe 15 years ago, somewhere, I think it was in 2008. I can't remember exactly, but so that's how far we've moved just in the past 2 decades, where a guy who was a settler terrorist, essentially, and this is Israel's determination, is now essentially overseeing this. And this dynamic, it's almost impossible to have someone perceived that way in Israel today as a settler terrorist because of where the government has moved.
Yeah, words fail me in trying to explain how insane it is that a guy like Smotrich gets to have so much. I mean, he's arguably, I would say almost certainly the second most powerful man in Israel after Netanyahu. You could even make the case that he's more powerful than Netanyahu in some instances because he has this sort of veto power over everything. He can collapse the government at any minute that he wants. So basically, like, he's the finance minister, which means, he's got the purse strings basically. And he's now essentially the governor of the West Bank. And so he's simultaneously signing off on every settlement building project that any settler has ever dreamed of. And then he's funneling money in from the state budget to pay for it. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but a hugely disproportionate amount of Israel's state budget is now going into building settlements, building illegal outposts, which means it's a settlement that has not even gotten the formal blessing from Israel, building infrastructure. There's all these new subsidies to build in the West Bank. And so the idea of this annexation project is basically what they're trying to do, and this has been the idea of it since the beginning, basically, is from inside the West Bank, chip away at the power of the military occupation and the power of the Palestinian Authority. And those are the two sort of governing institutions inside the West Bank, is the Israeli military and the Palestinian Authority. The PA has long been sort of considered a collaborator with Israel. And so Smotrich's government is chipping away at those powers and bringing them into the hands of the settlers. And then simultaneously, what they're doing is they are trying to basically take all of Israeli civil law and just move it east over to the West Bank and apply it across the settlements and apply it across the entire West Bank. And the idea there is that they don't want the West Bank to be considered, the redheaded stepchild. Like, this should be just part of Israel. And what's sort of ironic about it is that the settlers, they love to say, well, look, if Israel was founded on the basis of, its historical biblical connection to the land, then the Jewish people's connection in the West Bank or in Jerusalem is much stronger than it is in Tel Aviv or in Haifa or any other place. And they're right; they're absolutely right about that. So there's much more biblical history in the West Bank. That, as it turns out, is not actually what gives Israel the right to the state. That was a UN ruling. But anyway, so they're trying to just take all of the Israeli civil law and replace that with Israeli military law and anything the PA does. So that's sort of the backdrop before we get to this new moment.
And I want to just circle back to that too, because it's not, they want to apply the civil law to the Jewish Israelis there, and it's sort of like put the existing Palestinians into a separate box that they're not protected by the military occupation, if people can wrap their heads around that. So they're in sort of like a nether world of having absolutely no rights, even under like as being occupied. But we should say this point about the argument by the settlers that if you can justify the existence of Israel, it double justifies the existence of Israel annexing Judea and Samaria. This is a fundamentalist. The idea that this is about security it has been, sort of a fig leaf for decades. But this is a fundamentalist project because, and you can see that, just explain the difference between the way that these people perceive the West Bank versus Gaza.
Yeah. So in the Old Testament, Gaza is, it's the home of the Philistines, which is like the eternal enemy of the Jewish people and the Israelites. And there's various stories in the Old Testament of the Jews or the Israelites, conquering Gaza and razing it basically, but it would never became like a Jewish civilization there. Judea and Samaria is it's the cradle of ancient Jewish civilization. And, it should be said that the archaeological record there does in fact show that some of the earliest civilizations there were Jewish. Now, it was not actually the earliest civilization. There were people there before the Israelites were there. And there have certainly been lots and lots of civilizations after. So, just back to this sort of idea that they get to take the land because of, their connection to it. That's actually just not how it works. If that is how it works, then obviously, we couldn't be here in America and the whole world.
And also, Jasper, like many of the descendants of those folks are still in that region, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not as Palestinians, it's not necessarily like the Ashkenazi Jewish settlers who say it's their land.
Yeah.
Not that this should matter at all, but.
No, I mean, look, like you could twist yourself into pretzels, like trying to figure out who has the right to be here based on, their bloodline or whatever. And like, I know some Palestinians in the West Bank who say, we believe that we're the direct descendants of the Jews that were here. So like, they are not denying that there were Jews there, but they're basically saying that like, yeah, that's us now, or we're the descendants of them. So the point being like, that's why we have rules. Right. That's why, like, we have, governing bodies to settle these questions so that a bunch of religious fanatics can't just say, hey, look what we just found, a pottery shard from, King David. And so based on that, we're going to like drive these Palestinians off the land. So that's sort of like the fundamental attitude behind it.
But I just wanted to reiterate, though, that like if it was about security, it would not be defined by where Judea and Samaria is.
Right.
It would not say like, oh, we don't, Gaza is just a place for us to destroy. We don't need to occupy it. This is a fundamentalist project, and it has the zeal of religious fundamentalism as well.
Before we move on, can I just ask you to back up just for a second, Jasper, about the 1967? Because the other piece that's not really being talked about here is East Jerusalem and how that's been under occupation also since 1967. The big story about the West Bank, it appears to me over the past 2 months, has been this E1 settlement, which is in the middle of an already existing Israeli illegal settlement in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And can you explain the significance of that? I've done so a little crudely on the show, but with your expertise, I'd appreciate more context, because E1 has been the red line, basically, for every president over the past 30 years and saying the Israelis, you can't do this until Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's a great segue, actually, because, I mean, in my mind, the sort of rhetorical trick of talking about a two-state solution or self-determination for the Palestinian people, which, every Democratic politician does, even some Republican politicians do. That is a way to sort of check the box that, you support Palestinian people's right to self-determination, you support, their right to, live and just have basic human rights, but it is completely detached from what's actually happening on the ground. And that detachment is what Smotrich has exploited for the last several years. So basically, like, if you read Smotrich's words closely, and this guy's been talking and writing for a very long time, and he said a lot of things, his fundamental belief is that whatever the law says, whatever international law says, whatever Israeli law says, whatever our the diplomatic situation, however the UN chooses to recognize Palestine or not recognize Palestine, what ultimately is going to matter is the facts on the ground. And what that means is that if we have cities here, who's going to come get us out? Who's going to come get 750,000 settlers out of the West Bank? Who's going to, tear down our villages? And, there was this disengagement 20 years ago in Gaza and in parts of the West Bank. I think there were like 8,000 settlers that were removed. And it was like an enormous crisis.
They had to bring in tanks.
They were dragged out kicking and screaming. I mean, they put little orange stars on their shirts to, act like they were Holocaust victims. And so Smotrich understands you can say whatever you want, but hey, look, I built a whole city here. You're going to come tear down my city? Is that what you're going to do? And, not for nothing, but they also have all these weapons and stuff. So that's been his, and it's, in addition to the facts on the ground, it's what he calls changing the DNA of the system, which is that sort of change in governance where all the power now is in the hands of the settlers. And so I happen to think that Smotrich doesn't really give a shit what the UN says about Palestine or any of these things. In fact, it might even be a good distraction for him because, again, he's concerned with what are the things that I can do to make these changes irreversible. And so to your question, Emma, E1 has been the sort of red line for decades, specifically because, and I'll explain why in a second, but it really does, to use Smotrich's words, it's the final nail in the coffin for a Palestinian state. And so presidents like Biden and Obama and Bush Sr. and going back for a long time have basically, greenlit Israel to do, I don't want to say whatever it wants, but a lot, especially in the West Bank. But E1 has been the line you can't cross, because once that line is crossed, they lose their talking point. Right? They can no longer say two-state solution or Palestinian state because it doesn't exist anymore. And
because
so,
Jasper, of the geography, right?
Yeah,
because
so
it's
that's
in
what I'm going to explain
between.
now. So basically, in 1967, Israel occupied, a whole bunch of places, Gaza, Sinai, but over here it occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank. In 1980, I think, it formally annexed East Jerusalem, which means it just unilaterally declared this is now part of Israel. But the rest of the West Bank remained, occupied land, so not technically part of Israel. And so there are settlements in East Jerusalem, and then there's settlements all across the West Bank, which, basically cut Palestinian land up into these little isolated enclaves. But what the E1 is it's basically a line of settlements that goes directly from the settlements in East Jerusalem all the way across the West Bank to the settlements on the east side of the West Bank. So it's basically cutting the West Bank in half. So now you have the north and the south, and it's cutting East Jerusalem off from the West Bank too. So you've gone from what already was this, this patchwork of Palestinian controlled territory in the sea of Israeli land to now the same thing, except literally cut into three impenetrable or uncrossoverable, I can't think of the word, places. And so you now go from the idea of a Palestinian state to well, now you have three states over here. Gaza makes another state. And so it's just it is the idea of a Palestinian state in anything other than name just becomes increasingly undermined by this E1 settlement project. And they finally got the green light for it a couple months ago, in part because Trump doesn't care what they do, but also because Israel has realized oh, wait a minute, I think we can do whatever we want and nobody's going to stop us. So
they just bombed Qatar.
You're kidding? They did?
And apparently there were people even in the Trump administration going hey, wait a second. And it'll die down in a day or two. And
by the way, I want to get to this in a bit, but they did some incredible gymnastics to connect what's happening in the West Bank to justify the bombing in Qatar, because they really are going sort of all in on trying to make West Bank like Gaza, full of enemies. And so we'll get to that, but it was sort of remarkable to watch.
Well, why don't we talk about that, and then because then I want to get to the I guess the options, and how they, if these options are sort of like either ors or more of like a sequence.
I think we should probably go there first and then get to Qatar. So basically, like, point of everything I said is that Smotrich probably doesn't care all that much about a sort of formal annexation. However, what's changed now is there's this big push by all these different countries to recognize Palestine as a state at the UN. I think the vote is going to be like next week or in the next week or two. And, one of Netanyahu's projects for his entire life basically has been to prevent that. He just does not want Palestine to have any sort of legitimacy on the international stage. And so that is why Netanyahu and Smotrich and all these characters have been, basically propping up Hamas for all these years, because Hamas, and I mean, they've said this, Hamas is an asset to them in that, it's considered a terror group. They have no legitimacy on the international stage, whereas the Palestinian Authority can go to the General Assembly and they can talk. And, Mahmoud Abbas he's generally considered to be sort of useless and corrupt and weak, but like he can get an audience. I mean, Macron just met with him the other day. And so that's the worst nightmare for Netanyahu, who wants to just sort of like bury the Palestinians as an idea, as a people, certainly as a state. And so, but now that there's this big push to get a Palestinian state, which I think is like really sick, because some of these countries are saying like, I forget if it was France or the UK, but they were like, Israel, you have two choices: stop starving Gaza, or we give the Palestinians a state.
The UK, Keir Starmer being, the weakest guy ever. Yep.
It's like, okay, so we're talking to them like a toddler, like, stop giving them a wedgie, or like, I think the Palestinians should deserve basic rights regardless. But anyway, so Israel has said they will retaliate by annexing the West Bank, or that is basically what they have been threatening to do. And annexation, to be clear, it actually just means, again, saying this is now part of our country. It's what Russia did with Crimea and with a couple other territories in Ukraine in the last couple of years. And it would mean bringing Israeli law over across those territories. So the latest push now is as sort of retaliation for Palestinian statehood push. The options that are being discussed, the things to keep in mind are that what has stopped Israel from doing this in the past is, number one, the citizenship problem. If you just annex the entire West Bank, if you say the West Bank is now part of Israel, that's 3 million Palestinians who become part of Israel. The Jewish majority, is very, very, very slim at that point. If they annex the West Bank and Gaza, there is no Jewish majority. And so they can't just annex it, because, that's the end of the Jewish state, which of course points to like the whole hypocrisy of, the Jewish state, which is that it requires subjugating these people in order to exist as a Jewish state. So the sort of thinking behind the annexation plans is maximize land, minimize population. So they want to take as much land as they possibly can without also inheriting the Palestinians who are there. So just to quickly sort of fly through the options, and then I'll get to like what I think they're really considering. Option one would just be full West Bank annexation, which presents that citizenship problem, and also would create just enormous diplomatic backlash. I don't think they're really considering it, honestly. Another option would be just formally annexing the settlements, which basically does nothing. That would be just purely symbolic. They've also talked about annexing just Area C, which is like 60% of the West Bank. But the two options that they're considering right now, my understanding at least, is one of them would be annexing the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is basically like the entire sort of east coast, I guess, of the West Bank up against the Jordan River. So it goes from the Dead Sea up the Jordan River, up all the way up to the top of the West Bank. And what that would do if they annex the Jordan Valley, it's about 30% of the West Bank land-wise. It's by far the most fertile land in the West Bank. And, I'm sure your audience already knows about sort of the water wars or the water apartheid, I should say. But the other thing that it does is it fully encircles Palestinian territories within Israel. Because if you think about it right now, there is in fact a border between the occupied Palestinian West Bank and Jordan. There's a crossing from Jordan into the West Bank. I mean, you do have to go through the Israeli military to do it, but there is a border there. If they annex the Jordan Valley, now they've just drawn a circle basically around, they've encircled, any remaining Palestinian territory. And that is pretty popular among even like just the general population in Israel who doesn't always support the settlers. And it's because a lot of people, especially after October 7th, think of the West Bank and the settlement project as what they call their bulletproof vest. And, they are protecting the Israelis from the barbarians east of the Green Line. And the settlers love to say, well, October 7th never would have come from here because, we would have stopped them, blah, 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 blah. And so the idea of annexing the Jordan Valley is pretty popular among Israelis who just care about security more than anything else. And then the final option, which seemed, at least as of about a week ago, seemed to be the leading one, was this is Smotrich actually came out and proposed this plan. And it is basically it's the principle I said before of maximize land, minimize population. And so what it would do is it would annex the entire West Bank, except for the 6 biggest cities in the West Bank, which is Jenin, Tulkarem, Jericho, Ramallah, Hebron, and the one that I'm forgetting, Nablus. And so those are the major population centers. And so the idea would be they annex the entire West Bank. I think that Smotrich said less than 100,000, maybe 80,000 Palestinians would actually be within the territory that they annex. It's 82%. Not sure if I said that yet. And then there's still these little pockets of, Palestine, which I basically think they will continue to bomb out like they have Jenin and Tulkarem, displace people, ethnically cleanse. And then once they get the people out, again, they can now annex that land too, with the, same idea of maximize land, minimize population. So
essentially make 5 little Warsaw ghettos, essentially. 6.
Yeah.
And at any given time, starve them, bomb them, inhibit
kind of like Gaza.
Blockade them, but surrounded on all sides.
Yeah, Bantustan's match is set off, Mike, and that's a pretty good way to describe it. Yeah.
I think it is like Gaza. Yeah. 6 little Gazas basically. And, 2 of those 6 cities, Jenin and Tulkarem, have already been completely decimated by the Israeli military in the last year. And they're already now starting to, the raids across Ramallah and Jericho and Nablus are picking up. Just maybe 2 weeks ago, they literally robbed a bank in Ramallah. They, sent in special forces, robbed a bank, and then they claimed, and by the way, Ramallah is where the PA is based. They said, we're seizing Hamas terror funds. And so what they're doing is they are, making that connection between Hamas and the PA to then justify their further military action in Ramallah, which is always the strategy. It's Hamas is here, Hamas is there, Hamas has funds in this bank. So that's how they're going to go on attacking all these places.
Is there any, I think in your piece you mentioned the UAE may be the only sort of potential breaks on this. I don't know that it's actually a break, but we were just talking the other day you never hear the Arab street anymore in conversations about what Israel's doing or the United States is doing. There seems to be not the same, or at least, I don't see it written about if it's happening, because obviously, and I'm relying on, U.S. sources for the most part, British sources, but there does not seem to be any type of massive dissent on the Arab street that would be pressuring any of these Arab governments to pressure the U.S. or Israel for that matter. Now, maybe it's just that these governments aren't as sensitive to the pressure, or maybe it's happening and we just don't read about it as much because it might cause people in this country to say, hey, wait a second, Israel's creating a mess there. I mean, aside from where people are now. But so from your perspective, like, is there any sense that whether it's the UAE or any other country is, going to inhibit this, or that Israel will pay some type of price if they do this?
Yeah, a very real chance. I think that the UAE may, in fact, if anybody stopped it, it'll be the UAE. And so basically, like, what happened is in 2020, Netanyahu was considering some sort of an annexation. That was when Trump was in office, obviously. This was when Trump was, putting together the Abraham Accords, which were, of course, like, one of his, the crown jewel of his one of his like key diplomatic achievements. So he's in the process of putting together the Abraham Accords, and Netanyahu's threatening to annex the West Bank, and then I think it was a foreign secretary, some diplomat with the UAE, pulls an incredible move. She writes an op-ed in a huge Israeli paper. Honestly, I don't know how she got it published. It was like a big mainstream paper. I forget which one. And she basically says, it's in Hebrew. And she says to the Israeli people, you have a choice in front of you: annex the West Bank or normalize relations with the Arab world. And for those who don't know, normalization basically means like allowing trade and just normalizing economic and diplomatic relationships, which Israel needs if it's going to survive as this sort of isolated country in the Middle East. And so she writes that op-ed, and apparently the Israeli public very definitively were like, we want normalization. She also went straight to Trump and was like, are you going to let Netanyahu kill your big special fancy deal? And so, played directly to his ego. And Trump then immediately was like, you can't annex the West Bank. That's how the story goes, at least. The exact same thing is playing out now, actually. The only difference is we don't know if Netanyahu will listen. But the UAE, I think it was the
or
day
if Trump isn't like, I'm sorry, this time around, I sold off the annex rights to Miriam Adelson. Yeah,
well, I mean, he's not typically known for being good on paying off his debts. This is the thing, and like he
reminded Miriam Adelson that like he gave her the Golan Heights, and she didn't even ask for that the first time around.
That is true. I will just say that the UAE, the day after Smotrich put out this plan, I can't remember if it was who exactly it was, but somebody high up in government appealed directly to Trump in a paper and again said it would be a real shame if Israel destroyed one of the most important achievements in your legacy, Mr. Trump. And to be clear, they said annexation would be a red line. She didn't explicitly say it would kill the Abraham Accords, but I think she hinted at it, and she basically said, like, the dreams of including Saudi Arabia and these other countries in it would go to shit. And so I honestly think it's a coin toss. It's really hard to say what's going to happen. I mean, that is a very real material consequence that Israel does not want to face. The question is that enough to, stop them from doing this as retaliation for a Palestinian state? I just don't know, honestly.
Well, I mean, one, I think we should always have mention that many of these undemocratic leaders in the region are basically in cahoots with the United States and with some of the Western powers, and have been complicit in the genocide of the Palestinian people, in part because that benefits our interests in the region to kind of have these defanged undemocratic leaders, I should say. But what I am perplexed by is normalization is what is, from the Israeli perspective, what is the benefit there? Because they already have some of these informal relationships that's been reported on. They likely have arms deals with Saudi Arabia. It's all but in name at this point. I guess there's these two stories, one of Netanyahu using just brute force to create facts on the ground, committing genocide, not caring what the United Nations or the international community thinks. And then there's this other piece where he's immensely threatened by Palestinian statehood recognition by Western powers and also wants a formal deal of normalization. How do those two things interact with one another?
Well, they can't have all those things. And again, it's like this is the contradiction with Israel. You want to be a Jewish state in an Arab region, but you want to also be a democracy. Well, those things alone don't work. You want to have, free trade across the Arab world, but you also want to annex, an Arab country. Like none of these things can coexist, which is why they exist in a state of tension and, in being in violation of international law and sort of perpetual war. In terms of like this current sort of dilemma, I mean, I'll just give you a specific example of one way this is playing out right now. This is not with relation to the Abraham Accords, but it's about the, where money talks, basically. So there's this law matriculating through the Knesset, and I'm sure I talked about it on this show last year when we talked about archaeology, but it's this law that would basically take the governance of heritage sites in the West Bank, which to be clear is like a huge part of the West Bank, which is all, archaeological ruins everywhere you look. It would take those responsibilities away from this archaeology unit in the Israeli military and hand it over to the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which is who oversees archaeology sites in Israel. So it sounds like this sort of like, okay, you're switching governance or responsibilities from one party to another. What's the big deal? But the big deal is that the Archaeology Academy inside of Israel, who have essentially stayed silent through decades of illegal occupation archaeology and using archaeology as a weapon to try to erase Palestinian history and kick them off the land, they've come out in force against this, because what they're saying is, if you give Israel's government control over these archaeology sites in the West Bank, it incriminates all of us. We are now all complicit in illegal archaeology, and they're worried they're going to basically face boycotts from, archaeological conferences, from scientific journals. People are not going to work with them anymore because they are now all part of this illegal enterprise. And so that is like a perfect example of, this very sort of, I don't want to say very small group, but like a narrow group of people who recognize if we annex the West Bank, and that would be effectively a form of annexation, we're going to get blacklisted from the international community. And so they've come out against it, not because they give a shit about, who the Palestinians there or the sites there. They just don't want to, they want to be allowed to go to conferences and write in journals and stuff. And so those sorts of things are going to play out all across Israeli society of people, facing this, this sort of question of like, is it worth being potentially blacklisted by, our international industry or whatever it is?
That really ultimately becomes the question, is like, how much of a pariah state will Israel become in the event that they do take, any one of the options that you've talked about, because it makes it completely intellectually bankrupt, and all pretense of any soundness to say two-state solution. Like, there's no such. Like what could that even possibly look like? Like this sort of like this archipelago of little islands within Israel, and it seems to me that it's also a test as to like just how far gone down this fundamentalist, nationalist, fascistic wormhole the entire Israeli society has gone, right? I mean, obviously there's hashtag not every Israeli, but the point being that, like, look, people can make an assessment of the United States based upon things that we have done historically, and like people can make an assessment like Donald Trump has won 2 elections out of 3, like your notions of what's important to Americans may be a little bit, that's a reasonable assessment to make. In the event that Israel goes through with this, they're going to become a it seems to me, a one-way ticket to Pariah state. And I mean, God knows what happens after that. I mean, obviously, it's like a series of. South Africa could have gone a different way. Let's put it that way.
But well, the South Africa example is apt because given the amount of countries that Israel is bombing right now, I mean, that is one of the better historical examples because in the final throes of the apartheid in South Africa, I mean, they were bombing the hell out of Rhodesia. I think of Angola, a bunch of other countries in Africa, and that was their last gasp.
Well, the
Right.
difference is South Africa was not. There was not the fundamentalist sort of like spice to the whole thing.
I think though that is a good reminder of why security is always like the best pretext for Israel to do any of these things. And so like right after Smotrich makes that announcement about the potential 82% annexation, the story comes out in an Israeli paper. It was not printed in English. And it is the defense minister, Israel Katz, saying that they think September is a sensitive month in the West Bank, both because of the statehood drive. They say potential political developments, which is a clear allusion to potential annexation, and because the PA is nearing financial collapse, which is entirely the doing of Israel. And so what he says is basically we are anticipating that there could be attacks. And if there are, he actually said, we will pause military operations in Gaza and bring our forces over to the West Bank to fight a decisive war. And he basically says, like, if they want to do a third intifada, like, bring it. We'll come over there in full force. And, so much to say about that. But like, for starters, the settlers want nothing more than a third intifada.
Yes.
And the extremists in the government too. Actually, the IDF, to the extent that there are like reasonable people left at the higher echelons of the IDF and in Shin Bet and in Mossad, they have all said these moves that Israel has taken to dismantle the PA's economy, the Palestinian economy, is just making what they call terrorism more likely, and that has not stopped them at all. And in fact, like after this shooting the other day, Israel Katz immediately says, "Okay, we're freezing all work permits in these like 3 villages near where the settlers come from." Shin Bet comes back and says, "You're going to push more people to militancy if you take them out of jobs." And he basically says, "I don't give a shit."
Good.
And good. And so like they really are just itching for, a provocation that's going to lead to another, a third intifada to give them justification for, bringing the war over there. Now, the shooting happens in Jerusalem the other day on Monday. And
say six people,
6 people
dead,
were killed.
about that same injured.
Yeah, 6 people were killed at a bus stop in Jerusalem. It's a tragedy, and I think 67 people were killed in Gaza on the same day, it should be said. 2 children were killed in the West Bank on the same day, it should be said. But nonetheless, we don't like loss of innocent civilian lives, obviously. So that shooting happens, and it's kind of an interesting thing happens. First of all, all the leaders of Israel immediately start demanding that they go and raise the West Bank to the ground. Basically, Netanyahu and Katz both sort of allude to, we're going to do to these villages, which are these villages right next to Ramallah, which is again the capital of where the PA is based. We're going to turn them into Jenin and Tulkarem, which basically is we're going to do airstrikes. We're going to destroy them. And they immediately send troops in. They start circling these places. The thing is, I don't think they have the manpower, frankly, to launch an all-out war in the West Bank unless they actually do pause operations in Gaza. I mean, they're
Right.
Supposed to be calling up 60,000 reservists We know there's a refusal crisis. They have not put out the numbers around how many people have refused. But my point is, like, they have stepped up raids, and it's gotten much uglier, and people are dying and people are being arrested and villages are being cut off, but they have not brought an all-out war over there yet. And I think it's because, I think they actually would need to pause the operations in Gaza City, which it doesn't seem like they're going to do.
Well, can I, there's so much there. I know we've kept you for so long, but
and then we need to talk about Qatar really quickly before we go also.
Okay. I guess, well, one, I wanted to ask you more about that reservist crisis, because there's a lot of covering up of Israel, some of the weaknesses of Israel right now, including why did Iran and Israel's exchange of fire cease? Now, a lot of people are speculating that's because Iran actually was able to get through the Iron Dome and cause more damage than is being reported in the Western press. That's obviously very covered up in Israel. The other thing that's being covered up is this reservist crisis, where these are people that, like, the compulsory military service, they want to do a few tours and commit genocide and go home or whatever. They're not signing up for a multi-year-long situation in Gaza. And then the third dynamic is that they're just bombing rubble at this point. I know they want to annex the north. That's what this ground invasion of Gaza City is designed to do. But if they create a pretext in the West Bank, there's also this face-saving element that potentially benefits Netanyahu and protects him from the two dynamics that are looming that I just described, where you can move on from the hornet's nest that is Gaza, basically, to their project of greater land annexation.
I think it needs to be, like, people need to remember that Netanyahu, the thing that he's best at is kicking the can down the road. Like, he is famous for finding a way out of having to make, like, big decisions, and everything is sort of like in, a couple month increments. And so, I don't think that there is a plan for those things, Emma. Like, I'm not convinced that they actually think they can occupy Gaza City. I mean, there's 1 million people there. I think they say they've gotten 100,000 people out. That's another 900,000 people there. And it's the same thing with the West Bank. I mean, frankly, after I heard about the shooting, I woke up and saw the news and I was like, holy shit, I think that this is it. Like, they're about to bring the war over there. And I'm not saying it's not getting worse or it's not still going to happen, but it hasn't fully happened yet. And again, I think it's because they're stretched too thin at this point. And I don't think they have an answer to those things. I think they're, like, opportunistic, doing what they can to, obviously Netanyahu needs to stay in power so he doesn't have to face the corruption trial. I think that's part of it. On the Iran thing, I mean, that was, like, for him, a legacy moment. I think he probably thought, I did all I could here anymore, and they're going to kill more Israeli civilians and maybe we can't do any more damage. So, like, I think that they are sort of flying by the seat of their pants on some level. Yeah.
All right. So, Cutter.
Yeah. Just one quick point I want to make about it. So right after the shooting, Hamas comes out and basically praises it, says it was, like, a natural reaction to occupation or something like that. But they don't take credit for it. In fact, they, like, specifically don't take credit for it. The next day, Hamas comes out and says this was actually a Hamas operation. There are, like, splinter cells of Hamas in the West Bank, of course, but it could be just, like, two guys got in touch with them on Twitter or something, and, like, they helped them with training. Like, I don't know exactly what it means, but the reason I bring this up is because, like, an hour after that, or some tiny amount of time after that, Israel then bombs the Hamas negotiating headquarters in Doha, and Netanyahu comes out and says the shooting in Jerusalem was the impetus for it, was the trigger. Hamas thinks that they can keep killing us while they're negotiating peace. Well, then we're going to go and kill them. And so it's like, okay, first of all, obviously they've been planning this for more than an hour to be able to, like, bomb a sovereign country. So it's just bullshit on that level. But again, it's once again another example of them connecting the dots between what's happening in the West Bank and, Hamas and, the genocide, or for them, the war in Gaza. because they just want it to be sort of one, evil Palestinian enemy that they have justification to, just keep killing and keep bombing wherever they are, whether it's in Qatar or, Gaza or the West Bank. Something I was just thinking the other day is like, the Hamas guys also like to hang out in Turkey. Turkey is in the UN. Do we think Israel would bomb Turkey? And then would the UN have to respond? So they're just totally
in NATO.
I mean,
NATO,
yeah.
NATO,
right.
yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's unclear where at least the United States draws the line for Israel. So far, I haven't seen it.
Trump's had some tough talk, but it's literally exactly what Biden did. I'm very mad at Bibi Netanyahu, and then nothing changes.
If you haven't already, you should play the Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary. You should play what she said about Trump's response to the attack. It's honestly I want to study it. The way they both condemn it, but approve of it, would say this, but that. It's honestly they're also, obviously Trump is winging it on these things too, but they're Israel's bombed 6 countries this year. I think maybe all 6 of them in the last month. It's a rogue state. They're trying to ethnically cleanse greater Israel, which includes southern Lebanon, southern Syria, all the land from the river to the sea. It's a fucking catastrophe. And the world is just sort of sleepwalking into it.
Yep. Well, Jasper Nathaniel, the Substack is Infinite Jaz Substack.com. We'll put a link at majority.fm and our podcast and YouTube. And it is very difficult to find any type of coverage, period, of what's going on with the West Bank. Your Substack is a huge resource for people. Really appreciate you coming on, talking about these things, and can't encourage people enough to go and read about this stuff because, again, it is, for obvious reasons and less obvious reasons, what's happening in the West Bank does not get the coverage that it should be in this country. And so I really appreciate the work you're doing, Jasper, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam and Emma. Take care. I'll see you guys next time.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.